John. If I was to go around the room and ask the question, please name for me a minister of God, I wonder how many different names we would come up with. Name for me a minister of God. Probably hundreds. No doubt many people that have helped us lead various churches that we've been part of, people we've heard speak at a conference. We could think of many different ministers of God. I wonder if you could just have one of those ministers of God in your mind now, and I've got one in my envelope there. If you've got one in your mind, I wonder if any of you are going to have the same minister of God that I have. Is that what you're expecting? Did I get the same as anyone? Boris Johnson.
I got it.
Very good. Okay. Maybe not quite what you were expecting me to put up. Boris Johnson. Verse 2 of our passage says, authorities are appointed by God. Verse 4 says, he is God's servant. Verse 6 says, the authorities are ministers of God. How does it make you feel? What went through your mind when I showed you that name as a minister of God? I wonder how the Christians in Rome felt when Paul described the Roman emperor in that way. Now, obviously, I'm using these terms in a slightly different way to what maybe the impression I gave you. But still, these people, when they're acting in the function of their office, are described in the Bible as appointed servants and ministers of God for God's purposes. Now, Paul's just written about how we should treat one another, how we should treat one another in the church with genuine brotherly love, again, motivated by our trust of God. He's also written how we should treat those who persecute us and hate us by not seeking revenge, but leaving it to God to deal with. Loving our enemies instead. Again, motivated out of our trust of God and his authority to act instead of ours. And Paul knows that for Christians in Rome, there was another enemy, another big enemy that would be going through their mind, that someone that looked upon Christians with great suspicion. The Roman rulers, the authorities over them, the non-Christian leaders. How should they, as Christians, respond to the rule of Rome with its cruel leaders? Romans 13 verse 1 says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. Now, to be subject to something means to obey or be under their rule. It's the same word, the same Greek word is used in Ephesians 5 to talk about how we should submit to Christ. So it's not a half-hearted word. It means to be under, to obey. And it's likely that Paul writes this because some Christians had decided that now they were a Christian, they belonged to a different kingdom, the kingdom of God, which was true. They knew now that they were passing through, they were strangers in this world. This was no longer their home, which was true. They were citizens of heaven, and God was their king, which was true. But it may be leading some of them to start thinking, well, in that case, I can do whatever I want down here. I can do whatever I feel is appropriate here on earth, because these rulers have nothing to say to me. The Roman emperor is not my king. Jesus is. The UK government is not my king. Jesus is. And the Roman authorities at the time were really concerned and conscious of the fact that the Christians had a different king. And they were suspicious that the Christians would rebel, cause revolution, because they followed someone else and not Caesar. But Paul's instructions was, submit to the governing authorities. Even with a new King Jesus, who rules us, our go-to position, what would be presumed in most cases, our normal way of acting was submission to earthly rulers. There was a presumption, or should be a presumption and an expectation, that a Christian will not just put their own preferences above what the governing authorities said to do. Not a command for blind submission, because there are exceptions and we'll get on to that, but it's defining what should be normally expected from us. Now, depending on our character, some of us in this room will be thinking, great, that's just what I like to hear. Easy, simple, follow the rules, good stuff. But others will be thinking, what? Surely it's not that important to God what some of these smaller things, yeah, the big stuff maybe occasionally, but only some of it. Because we have different personalities, we have different inbuilt desires. And both groups need to be careful. Because whatever our natural tendency is, we have a strength and we have a weakness. The one who thinks, great, I like this, it's going to be easy to follow this Romans 13 instruction, is also the person that's going to struggle to spot the exceptions. You are likely to be slow to notice when a time arises that you should break what the rules are. You'll be hesitant to do it, over hesitant to do it. But the one who thinks, what, do I really have to do this, is going to help the rest of us to see those times when we need to say no to Mr. Authority, when it's going against what God says. But your questioning strength is also your weakness, because it's going to make you want to say no to authority more than you should. In this church, we have both. Yes, we have mainly, yes, lovely rules, but we do also have others of a different view too. Now, social media is known to be an echo chamber. We have one opinion and we keep clicking on things and reading things. And in the end, we end up seeing more and more people with the same opinion as us. And it helps us, so we think, to get to the truth. But all it is doing is fixing our opinion more and more in a particular direction. More people like us proving that we are right. But it also makes us less willing and less able to genuinely hear the other side. But church is not meant to be an echo chamber. God saves people from all personalities, all backgrounds, all styles, all different ways of processing the world. And it's the richness that that brings that hopefully makes us more rounded as individuals and corporately as a church, and therefore more discerning. Hopefully we balance each other out a bit. But in order to do that, we need to genuinely listen to people that see things differently to us. We need to really hear each other and not just reject someone because they have a different point of view. And hopefully in doing that, we as a church, as a group of people, will get a better balance about difficult instructions to obey authorities and when to say no. Now let's see why God inspired Paul to write, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities," and then we'll look at how. First of all, the why. Verse 1, "For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed." See, God, it says, has all authority. God rules. God is sovereign. God is the ultimate king. And God is bringing about his purposes at all times. And one of the ways he does that is through delegating some of his authority to different people, believers and unbelievers. And Ben mentioned a few of them. He delegates some of his authority to employers, to husbands, to parents, to church leaders, to emperors, to kings, to queens, to presidents, to governments, to different levels of authority. Do you remember what Paul wrote in Romans 9 about Pharaoh? "For this very purpose I have raised you up, that I might show my power." Pharaoh was an unaware servant and minister appointed by God to bring about his big picture purposes. And then we have what Daniel writes, Daniel chapter 2, verse 20. Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. Chapter 5 of Daniel, the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. And in keeping with this, Paul writes, those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Now, please don't misunderstand me. Paul and I are not saying that these leaders and authorities are godly and righteous. No, the Bible gives us the understanding that these are unaware servants. They're unaware that they serve God and his purposes. Their sinfulness they own, but they are serving God's unaware purposes. They are unaware ministers, unaware that it was God that raised them to power. They were unaware, but we should be aware. They don't know, but we do. Now, these leaders are rarely, very rarely seeking to do God's purposes. They're much more likely to be sort of similar to Joseph's brothers, who, for their own evil reasons and purposes, decided to sell Joseph to be a slave. But we're told that God meant it for good. So the answer to the question, why do we submit to the governing authorities, is because we understand that their authority is delegated to them from God. They are unwitting, unknowing, unaware servants. And as Paul mentions in one place in particular, preventing anarchy by providing structure, security, law, and order. In verses 3 and 4 we get, for rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Verse 4, but if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. God uses his unaware servants to restrict much evil from operating openly and actively in society, empowering them to bear the sword, to punish wrongdoing on his behalf. So the why do we submit? They are put in place for that time and that moment by God to fulfill his big picture purposes. But what about the question, how? How are we to be subject to authorities? Now, a little boy was in a church service and he couldn't see the words of the song. So he stood on his chair to make him as tall as the adults so he could see the words. He stayed there for all of the songs, but when everyone else sat down, he stayed standing on his chair. His mother said, sit down, please. Sit down, please. Sit down now. Sit down. But he refused. So she picked him up and put him down so that his backside was sitting on the chair. And the little boy turned to his mum and said, I may be sitting down on the outside, but I am standing on the inside. When it comes to submitting to God, are we standing on the outside, or are we standing on the inside? Are we sitting down as we should, submitting to him, or do we do it through gritted teeth, annoyed by his attitude? What about how we should be to the authorities who've been instituted by him? We find the answer in verse 7. Pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes is owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. So firstly, we are to do what is right. In this context, it was taxes and revenues. We are to pay what we should, what we owe. That's not to say we necessarily should pay as much as possible. I'm sure that within this we have the understanding that we have to pay what is right and fair and what the law says we should. But that's as far as it goes, in a way that obeys our authorities. But then the instructions move from the outside action to the inside attitudes. We're to show right respect and right honour to those God has placed in positions of authority over us, in recognition of the office they hold, even if we struggle with them as an individual. It's not to say we can't disagree with governing authorities. It doesn't say we can't campaign against the government's position on something we consider to be wrong, but we must do it with honour and respect and within what the law tells us we can do. We're free to disagree with them vehemently. We see John the Baptist calling out immorality in the authority of his time, complaining how Herod was sleeping with his brother's wife. So we can use whatever means is at our disposal to seek to change ideas and policies, but with respect and honour for their position. When Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego disagreed with the request from their authority, they still spoke respectfully to the king. And when the law didn't change, they chose not to submit and to take the consequences, which brings us on to some of the exceptions we see. Because the Bible shows us there are times when it is right not to submit. This is not a contradiction of what Paul is saying. In more, it's a fleshing out of the details. Our default position is that we follow unless there is Bible reason why we shouldn't. See, verse 1 tells us that we are submit to the governing authorities because God gives them their authority. But God doesn't give anyone authority to tell people to disobey him. He doesn't give people permission and authority to say, you must disobey me. To disobey God is where the line stops. John Stott explains it like this. The principle is clear. We are to submit right up to the point where obedience to the state would entail disobedience to God. But if the state commands what God forbids, or forbids what God commands, then our plain Christian duty is to resist, not to submit, to disobey the state in order to obey God. And there's a famous example that maybe even has come to your mind in Acts 5, verse 27. It says, when they were talking about the apostles in the early church, when they had brought them, they set them before the council, and the high priest questioned them, saying, we strictly charged you not to teach in this name. Yet here you have filled Jerusalem with your teachings, and you intend to bring this man's blood upon us. But Peter and the apostles answered, we must obey God rather than man. When an authority tells you to go against what the Bible clearly tells you about God's instructions, it's not we can disobey if we want to or if we feel brave enough, but we must disobey and obey God. But this isn't talking about when we just don't like a law, when our own preference thinks it's a bit stupid. When it comes to issues of preference, culture, desires, we are to be subject. Our default position is to be subject to the authorities. But instructions to disobey what God says haven't got anything to do with preference or culture, and we need to be bold to follow God. Now, 30 years ago, this was much less of a pressing issue in our country. It was something we prayed about for Christians abroad. But our country is on the fast track through a sort of secularization aim and a rejection of our Christian background, our Christian heritage that so many laws were based upon. We need to know where to draw the line, how to decide when it's one of the exceptions and not just part of the normal pattern of life. I'll give you 3 examples that aren't an issue yet, but could become. It could become against the law to tell people that certain things they do are sinful because it will offend and harm their well-being. We're not that far away from that position. It could be changed that for a church to be a registered charity and benefit from gift aid, from money back from the government, that you won't be allowed to say that Jesus is the only way. We're not there yet, but it could be. It could become against the law to pray with someone who wants help with their sexuality because it infers that something might need fixing. How will you expect churches to react? How will you expect us as leaders to act? What will you do at those times. I want to explore further two examples. Let's just imagine that a law was passed tomorrow that says it was illegal to pray for the next 4 weeks. What would you do? Would you A, say more prayers than normal today and then take a break knowing that God would understand? Would you B, campaign and march and sign a petition against this new law but stop praying for 30 days? C, would you turn the lights off and hide under the bed and really quietly under your breath pray? Or D, would you turn up to a church prayer meeting that was being advertised all over the internet and pray in the normal way? What would you do? What did Daniel choose to do? When he prayed, he was on his own and not in a prayer meeting, but he pretty much went for option D, or the equivalent of. He heard about a new law saying you couldn't pray to anyone apart from the king, and he went up to his open window of his house and prayed. We love that story. But what would we do? What would we think? We'll think, well, I'll get a criminal record. Surely God wouldn't want that. Daniel knew the possible consequences, and they happened, but he still did it. He still chose to obey God. Here's a second example. If there was a law passed that for the next 4 weeks there could be no church meetings, what would you do? Would you find an evening service to go to tonight and then take a break for 4 weeks? Would you campaign and march and sign a petition but stop meeting? Would you sneakily meet with 3 or 4 others midweek and have a mini church in your home? And would you turn up here at 10 a.m. on a Sunday as normal, regardless of the risks? A, B, C, or D? Now, I think we're talking about those two examples. I think we're unlikely to have the no praying. That's very hard to monitor, isn't it? But no church meeting for 4 weeks or no church meeting for 4 months could easily happen in the future because for COVID reasons, it happened in the past. Today's verses, the situation with Daniel and the lion's den, Daniel and his friends in the fiery furnace, and the apostles saying we will obey God rather than men, all had to be taken into consideration when churches were deciding how to react to that government statement that you should stop gathering. It's not always simple. It's not always as simple as just saying we must be subject to the governing authorities, because although that's our default position, we need to always be prayerful about, is this one of these situations that God clearly says we should stand against? Now, some Christians came to the conclusion that we should ignore those government laws that were only a matter of a year or so ago and keep gathering. And so that's what they decided to do, even if it meant being fined or imprisoned. Now, we took the position that this was a temporary safety issue rather than a direct attack against the church and God's people. So we stopped. But as time went on and more evidence became apparent and new variants came out, and some of the rules became more and more inconsistent and illogical, it was increasingly moving to a position closer and closer to where we might have had to say, actually, we need to meet. But it's complex. But these are real issues that we have to grapple with. They're difficult situations, difficult for a church, but they're difficult for all of us. And I'm convinced that we're going to be, in a future, having to make more and more of those decisions personally and corporately. We need to be prepared. We need to think ahead. And the thing that will help us the most is to be fully trusting that what verse 1 says is true, which is that God has all authority. Which means we can obey the governing authorities happily when they are following his ways. But we should decide that a UK law that goes against God's ways, we can still trust that he has authority, that we're still secure because of all the authority he has, and again obey God's direct authority. In those situations, we don't know what God will do. We know his authority makes all things possible, though. God has the authority over the birds to cause them to bring food to someone who's hiding. God has authority over ferocious animals to cause them to sleep rather than eat, Daniel. God has authority over the winds and the waves to cause them to cease. He has authority over fire to cause it not to burn those who are thrown into it. As we put our hope, our trust, our confidence into the loving hands of our Father in heaven, we can trust, we can have peace in his care, and we can say these words that we find other people in the Bible saying, and say them with confidence about our equivalent situation. Our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods. We need to be known as good citizens, subject to the governing authorities, but only to the extent that they don't overstep their God-given remit. And when they do go against God, let's have boldness to trust and serve the one true King who has all authority and who has our lives in his hands. Let's pray. Father, when we read these words that are in your word, Lord, they bring up many challenges for us. Lord, and our desire is to be led by you to understand the detail as well as the general. Lord, help us to be willing to submit to those that you've put in authority over us. Lord, in many different situations, right from kings and governments, right down to people in our workplace or in our home. Lord, may we see that our obeying them is obeying you who've put them there. But Lord, give us eyes to see, an awareness of when they overstep and are asking us to disobey you. Give us boldness at that time. Help us to trust that you have all authority and that you will be faithful to us and either draw us home or protect us. But Lord, may we not do things from fear, but do them with boldness and courage because we trust you. Amen. We're going to sing a couple of songs to finish. And we're going to sing our praise to the one that we can trust, who is always faithful to us and who reigns over all.